Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience. My name is Sharice Reyes, and I am the chair of the Social Action Committee of the Atlanta Suburban Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. And along with my colleague, Sora Teresa Montgomery, who is the chair of the Physical and Mental Health Committee, we welcome you to this year's Domestic Violence Awareness Panel discussion. I'm going to turn to my Madam President, Sabrina Clark, and ask her to bring you greetings.
Good evening. As Sharice stated earlier, I am Sabrina Clark, the president of the Atlanta Suburban Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority. And on behalf of our over 400 members, I would like to welcome you to our domestic violence panel discussion entitled Break the Silence. The Atlanta Suburban Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta, affectionately abbreviated as ASAC, is dedicated to providing quality programs and leading the way in social action within our community. Domestic violence can happen in all situations, not exclusively in a specific economic or educational scenario. Whether you have questions about warning signs, how to find resources to help you get out of a dangerous situation, or just curious how domestic violence crimes are prosecuted, we hope there will be information shared tonight that will assist you. I would like to extend a special thank you to our Social Action Committee and our Physical and Mental Health Committee for collaborating on this much needed topic. Thanks again to our audience for joining us, and please enjoy the webinar. Back to you, Sharice.
Thank you so much, Madam President. So if we can just set the stage for this discussion, as we all know, October is Domestic Violence Awareness and Prevention Month, and Congress designated October Domestic Violence and Awareness and Prevention Month in 1989 to raise awareness to this important issue affecting millions of people. In fact, recent data shows that 1 in 3 women, 1 in 4 men, and 1 in 2 trans or non-binary individuals experience domestic violence or intimate partner violence at some point in their lifetime. So what we know statistically is that those of you who are with us today, you've either experienced this or you know someone who's experienced this. And so it was important to us to have a conversation with our community and provide resources and information for how you can address these issues. So now, without further ado, let me get to our amazing panel. I'm going to introduce our panel, and then after I've introduced the entire panel, I'm going to ask them to provide some opening comments to us for this discussion. So first up, we are very pleased to have with us the very distinguished guest, Mr. Charles A. Brooks, who is the Solicitor General of the State Court of Clayton County, Georgia. If I can just introduce him, just a couple of words I'll say is that Mr. Brooks is a dedicated public servant who has taken an intriguing journey from educator to lawyer and now holds the esteemed position of Solicitor General of the State Court of Clayton County, Georgia. His passion for justice, education, and making a positive impact on society has been the driving force behind his professional path. He is the epitome of commitment to upholding law and serving community. Even before becoming a licensed attorney, he began his legal career at the Clayton County District Attorney's Office, where he specialized in criminal prosecution of all levels of felony offenses. His time in the District Attorney's Office provided him with invaluable experience representing the state of Georgia and navigating complex legal matters. He built a reputation for his tenacity, attention to detail, and commitment to achieving justice for those he served. His commitment to public service and passion for making a positive impact on the community led him to a new chapter in his career where he was appointed as a Solicitor General of the State Court of Clayton County, Georgia. In this esteemed role, he bears a responsibility for representing the state in criminal cases, upholding the law, and seeking justice for victims while ensuring the fair treatment of those accused. As the Solicitor General, he is deeply committed to maintaining the integrity of the legal system and fostering a safe and just community for all citizens. He's also a proud graduate of the Alabama State University, where he received his Bachelor of Arts degree in history, and he obtained his JD from the University of Georgia School of Law. So welcome to Solicitor General Charles Brooks.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yes. And in a moment, you're going to give your opening statement, Counselor. We also have Melissa Arthur, and Miss Arthur is the Vice President of Prevention and Outreach for the Partnership Against Domestic Violence, also known as PADV. For those of us who have worked in ASAC and worked alongside ASAC for years, you know this is one of our community partners that we frequently partner with. So we're so excited to have Miss Arthur on the panel today. In her role as the Vice President of Prevention and Outreach, she is responsible for the development, expansion, and supervision of PADV's dating violence prevention, community outreach, and community outreach and legal advocacy programs. She also works within the community to bring awareness to domestic violence by engaging the community through trainings, presentations such as these, and public speaking events. Prior to her current position as VP of Prevention and Outreach, Melissa worked as the managing legal advocate for PADV, where she worked extensively helping survivors of domestic violence file protective orders, navigate through the legal system, and locating resources. Utilizing her work with survivors, Melissa is extremely passionate about having survivors' voices heard and working to create policies that will provide systemic change within Georgia. Melissa received her bachelor's and master's degrees in criminal justice from Mercer University. Welcome to Melissa Arthur. Our next panelist, April Ross Esquire. April currently serves as the Executive Director for the Georgia Commission on Family Violence, also known as GCVFV, the state agency tasked with developing a response and engaging organizations, communities, and systems across the state to strengthen Georgia's families and intimate partner relationships by ending family violence. GCFV's mission is to provide leadership to end family violence by promoting safety and accountability, improving access to justice, and ensuring adequate and meaningful resources and services for all. As Executive Director of GCFV, Ms. Ross works to give meaningful leadership to Georgia's response to family and intimate partner violence through the coordination of comprehensive and effective awareness, prevention, and intervention. She is a zealous and compassionate advocate for children, women, and men who find themselves in the grips of unhealthy, toxic, or abusive relationships. She is a graduate of Emory University School of Law and a member of the Georgia Bar since 2011. She began her professional career in marketing before pursuing a law degree. Prior to law school, she obtained her Master's of Business Administration and Bachelor of Science in Business degrees from the Florida A&M University. Shout out to FAMU. Following her passion, she began her legal career in public service as an assistant district attorney at the Fulton County VA's office. As a young prosecutor, she worked on various felony cases before being assigned to the investigation and trial team for the Atlanta public school cheating scandal, where she made notable contributions. She is a member of the Atlanta Suburban Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. And if you've followed her story, you'll know that she is an advocate of domestic violence, a strong advocate, and she has a testimony in this area. On April 25th of 2014, her life was tragically altered when her estranged husband shot her multiple times after she filed for divorce. The attack left her paralyzed from the chest down. Since the shooting, Soror Ross has advocated for implementing policies and systemic responses to domestic violence in Georgia that enhance safety for victims, enforce accountability for abusers, and help survivors of abusive relationships reclaim their lives. She is a strong believer in awareness and prevention. She works to educate the public about recognizing early signs and safely escaping abusive relationships. She facilitates training and speaks to survivors, students, the law enforcement community, victim advocacy organizations, and the public and private sector about fostering understanding, allyship, and energy for change against the epidemic of abuse and violence in both family and intimate partner relationships. She volunteers as a peer support mentor for patients at the Shepherd Center with recent spinal cord injuries, particularly those whose injury was the result of domestic violence and or gun violence. Soror Ross, we welcome you to the panel. We also have with us two more panelists, Simone Hilton, who also is a member of the Atlanta Suburban Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta and the Social Action Committee. So thank you to Sora Hilton for joining us. She is, but in her professional capacity, she is the Deputy District Attorney with Fulton County District Attorney's Office under the esteemed leadership of our District Attorney, Ms. Willis. Ms. Hilton leads the Brenda Boham Domestic Violence Unit. This unit is responsible for the prosecution of intimate partner cases to include homicides, aggravated assault, and battery cases. Prior to her position in the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, she served as a senior assistant district attorney in DeKalb County District Attorney's Office in the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Unit and the Sexual Exploitation and Crimes Against Children Unit. She has handled cases ranging from drug offenses to homicide cases. She started her prosecution career in 2010 at the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. While at the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, she received several awards to include the Superstar, Major Case Rookie of the Year, the Trial Unit Attorney of the Year, and Rising Star Awards. She has trained attorneys across the state of Georgia on topics such as recanting witnesses, domestic violence homicides, mental health defenses, and child abuse. She was originally born and raised in the Philadelphia area, but she's now a Southern peach like the rest of us. And she made Georgia her home after graduating law school. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree in Legal Communications from BHU, Howard University. I know that's what you want me to say. No disrespect to my friends from Hampton. And she received her JD from North Carolina Central University School of Law in 2008. Currently, she also serves as the president of the National Black Prosecutors Association, a past president of the Greater Atlanta Black Prosecutors Association, and secretary of the DeKalb Lawyers Association. She is also an adjunct professor at Emory University School of Law, where she teaches trial techniques. She is a career prosecutor and enjoys recruiting and training future prosecutors. So for anybody looking for a job, take her information. She is a proud member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated and is active in her church, Cascade University Methodist Church in Southwest Atlanta. So welcome again to Sora Hilton. And last but certainly not least, we have Karima Dillard. And Ms. Dillard is the Director of Policy for the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Karima has been part of the domestic violence movement since 2017, first as an intern advocate and then as manager of community partnerships for a local domestic violence agency. In her current role with GCADV, her primary focus is to collaborate with coalition members, lawmakers, and key stakeholders in advocating for local and federal policies that uphold and protect the interests and rights of survivors across the state of Georgia. She also sits on the Public Policy Committee for the National Network to End Domestic Violence and the National Prevention Council, where she works with advocates and community members on developing national prevention strategy. If that wasn't enough, in addition to her public policy work, she also provides support to the Justice for Incarcerated Survivors program through the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence by building alliances to promote policy collaborations across issues such as criminalized survivorship. You're going to have to break that down for us. Poverty, homelessness, immigration, and human rights. She also served as an adjunct faculty in Georgia State University Social Work Department, where she lectures and assists with curriculum development for the university's bachelor's and master's level students. So as you can see, we have a panel of experts here to provide you with information. So without further ado, let me open it up to our let me open this up to our first panelist to give us greetings. And like I said, all of our panelists, we'll start with Mr. Brooks, go to Ms. Ross, and then Ms. Hilton, then Ms. Dillard, and then Ms. Arthur. We're asking for opening comments in this area. What do we need to know from your organization about dealing with combating domestic violence in 2023? Mr. Brooks?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Awesome. My name again is Charles Brooks. I'm Solicitor General in Clayton County, and on behalf of the Office of Solicitor General of State Court of Clayton County, I want to bring you greetings And thank you for hosting this very timely conversation. It's not an easy conversation to have, but it's a necessary conversation to have because often, too often, the topic of domestic violence is one that's talked about it's taboo topic, and people are ashamed to talk about it. But it's only through open and honest dialogue and open and honest conversations that we actually get to shed light on the signs of domestic violence and actually and preventing how to prevent domestic violence. So I look forward to this conversation. I'm awed by this panel. I am not even an expert by comparison to the other folks who are on this panel. So thank you for allowing me to be on this panel. And I'm looking to really learn something and engage in the conversation as well.
Thank you so much, Mr. Brooks. Sora Ross.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm so happy to obviously be talking about this topic because it is something I'm very passionate about. I have been at the Commission on Family Violence now for 4 years, and what's really important to me is understanding that everybody plays a part. It's something that can affect your life directly through someone you love and know, or personally. But it's also affecting people in your community all around you. And that has an impact on how we all live and operate day to day. So everybody has a part to play. I think it's everybody's responsibility to understand as much as you can to educate yourself about domestic violence, and also know how to talk to someone else, because it's not necessarily about being an expert or a pro, but it is about understanding and having some sensitivity about the issue so that you can be a voice that's helping someone and also contributing to getting us out of this culture of silence so that there's not as much shame on the topic. I would say specifically in communities of color, it is affecting our communities at higher rates than it affects other communities. And so we certainly have an important part to play in making the people in our community feel comfortable and feel safe, making sure that we are impressing accountability as a measure that we believe in. And it's not just about arresting and locking people up, but accountability can take a lot of different forms in a community. We talk a lot about restorative justice and transformative justice, as well as things communities can do to help, break that cycle. But I just want to say thank you so much. And hopefully this will be a great, robust conversation. I'm familiar with all the folks on this call, and glad to see some old faces, and we work together very closely on a regular basis. So that's what it's about, a coordinated community response.
Thank you so much, Sora Ross. Sarah Hilton.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you so much for having me for this important discussion that is necessary. What I hope to bring to this conversation is an understanding about the criminal justice process and how that actually works in cases of intimate partner violence. I am proud to lead the first domestic violence unit within the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. Madam District Attorney created this unit when she was elected in 2021. And she'll tell you it came from a story of her own family member who was murdered at the hands of her husband, who she had been with for 30 years. And that is who Brenda Bayham is. That is who our unit is named after. And so this unit was created in order to have individuals who specifically only prosecute these types of cases. These cases are just different in how they're prosecuted, because you are dealing with individuals who love their partners, who have relationships with their partners. And sometimes that can be more challenging. And like Sora Ross just said, that accountability isn't always incarceration. And so what I want to do today is have an opportunity to talk about what that process may look like, because every individual who is a victim or survivor may be in a different stage in their life. And so how we handle that case will depend on where our survivor is, because essentially we just want to make that person whole as much as we can after we leave and after we're removed from the process. And so that is what my hope is today, to answer any questions that anyone may have about the criminal justice process, but give more understanding and clarity to what we do on our end once we receive a file involving intimate partner violence.
Thank you so much, Sarah Hilton. We absolutely look forward to getting that additional information and digging deeper into that discussion. Ms. Dillard, I'll go to you for your opening statement.
Thank you so much, Sharice. I want to start out by saying thank you for inviting me. I'm a Delta legacy, so I feel my mom smiling down right now. So happy that you all are talking about this. And I'm even happier to hear so many of us on the panel really talk about something that I talk about quite often, and that is that we can't prosecute our way out of this situation. When we look at laws that impact victims and survivors of domestic and intimate partner violence, I really want us to kind of expand our aperture to include laws that we wouldn't necessarily associate with victims. So laws such as Medicaid expansion, TANF reform. These are bills and laws that you wouldn't necessarily associate with victims of domestic violence. But the reality is victims are our next door neighbors, our church members, our co-workers. So if we pass a paid leave policy and you work at an agency and you could benefit from paid leave, that absolutely impacts domestic violence. So really thinking more about who the victims are, kind of erasing this image that we have of the perfect victim as being, I'm Gen X, so burning bed was very popular when I was coming up, and so many people have the vision of, who was that, Heather Locklear or whomever it was, the tiny blonde white victim of violence, bruised from head to toe. And the reality is domestic violence doesn't always look like that. So I'm hoping that I can bring a shift in perspective about who we're actually talking about and what laws we could impact that could really address domestic violence holistically.
Thank you so much for that. No, those are excellent points that you've made, and we really look forward to delving deeper into those issues of policy, in addition to providing resources. But now I want to turn to Ms. Arthur as a representative for PADV, and can you give us your opening comments?
Sure. I first want to say thank you for having me on here. I feel very humble and privileged to be amongst such a wonderful panel of experts tonight. I hope to have a voice that comes from a place of resources and what's really available to our survivors. I do want to also be a voice of bringing some perspective from our survivors and putting their voice in this conversation as well. Having the privilege to assist directly on the front line and being able to hear their concerns, where gaps are, and how they would like to see some changes. So I'm hoping to bring their voice to this conversation tonight, as well as expertise of learning from most of the panel tonight, because I don't know Solicitor General as of yet, but I've had the pleasure of working with all the others on the panel. So I'm just here to really provide that resource base, as well as some of the voices from our survivors that we work with day in and day out.
Thank you so much, Ms. Arthur. I mean, it's so important that we center these conversations in the voices of the survivors. And so that we can start this discussion, I want to make sure we're all on the same page, because, we hear October as Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We've heard the stats related to domestic violence, or sometimes we hear it referred to as intimate partner violence. But so that we're all operating from the same starting point, this first question is going to go to Melissa or April or Karima. How are we defining domestic violence for purposes of this discussion?
I can take that. Or Melissa, would you like to take it? I see that you've unmuted.
Oh, I didn't know which one of us was going to take it, because I know we're all able to answer it. I don't know if we have different definitions. I can tell you what my definition is pretty much a pattern of abusive behaviors which could be physical, emotional, financial, psychological, but it can happen in any relationship that one partner is trying to either gain or maintain that power control over their intimate partner. And that's how I would answer it, but I'm not sure if April or Karima wants to add something to that.
Oh, I certainly agree. And I'll just add that, when we talk about something Karima said, which is it's difficult to know what it looks like because it doesn't look the same every time. One thing I like to emphasize is that domestic violence is a misleading term. I always say that it's not my friend because it leads people into a false sense of security that if there's no physical violence, you are not in an abusive relationship. And that is 100% not true. With respect to domestic violence, I honestly tell people too, there's two ways to define it. There's the legal definition, and then there's the definition in practical, in the practical world. The legal definition is important though, because that tells us what the law can get, where the Justice Center can enter the picture and provide, its support or its version of justice. But in reality, domestic violence is way broader than what our justice system allows us to prosecute. We're talking about coercive controlling behaviors. Melissa just named a number of different types of and forms of abuse. But it's just really important to know that it is not limited to physical violence. And more often than not, physical violence is something that happens down the line, and that there are many more forms of abuse that have been taking place long before the first blow is struck.
And so, Karima, can you expand on that, and then also talk about just how prevalent of an issue is domestic violence in the state of Georgia?
Absolutely. The professor in me is coming out just in terms of terminology. So you'll hear April just talked about the statutory terminology that's used in our statute. We hear family violence a lot. So that incorporates intimate partners and family members. We just passed a dating violence protective order bill in 2021, I believe. So that just, it expanded the definition to include dating partners who may or may not live together, who don't have to share a child in common. And you also will hear intimate partner violence, gender-based violence. A lot of us use these terms interchangeably, and we're essentially talking about the same thing. I think it depends on your audience. And for today, I think we will probably go back and forth between IPV and DV and GBV, but just know that we're talking pretty much about the same thing. In terms of prevalence, I actually want to toss it over to my dear colleague, April, because the commission has done really exhaustive work pulling together our statewide statistics. So April, I'm sure you can answer that.
Yeah, there's some, thank you so much, Karima. For more than 15 years, my agency, at one point it was in collaboration with the Georgia Coalition. We did the Fatality Review Project. Right now, my agency continues that. And what we do is take all of the family violence data and we extract that from the GBI. So the Georgia Bureau of Investigations is the statewide entity that essentially collects all crime data for Georgia. And so what we ask them to do is, hey, give us all of the data that deals with family violence incidents. As Karima said, family violence is the legal term in Georgia, but it encompasses more than that. And we then analyze and extract that data into a report. And so what I can tell you about domestic violence impacts in Georgia, right now, Georgia ranks 30th in the nation for the rate of women killed by men. And that's out of the Violence Policy Center of 2022's report. And in that report as well, Georgia actually ranked 4th in the nation for murder-suicide incidents in 2019, in the year of the study, in the last 6 months of the study, and which is pretty severe. And that spike has only been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. I will just say as a reference, and I know we'll probably talk about resources later, the Commission on Family Violence, as a result of the murder-suicide rates increasing in Georgia over the last 7 or so years, we did create a project called the Support for Survivors of Murder-Suicide Project. And that is right now the only direct service project in the nation that is specifically designed and specialized for people who are survivors or surviving family members of a person who is killed by or perpetrated a murder-suicide, because we do not believe the perpetrators' family members are also the perpetrators. Sometimes they get stigmatized, but they are also actually victims of those incidents. And so our program services all of them. But I'll also just say quickly, in 2022, victims of domestic and sexual violence made over 129,000 calls to crisis centers. Law enforcement officers reported more than 42,000 family violence incidents. That was in 2021. And as far as temporary protective orders, we had 17,682 ex parte temporary protective orders issued. 41% of those went on to become permanent protective orders in Georgia. And that's just sort of a broad scope of some of our prevalence rates in Georgia and some of what our state's response is looking like, or how the impact of that response is.
And thank you so much for those statistics. And we're going to talk to Solicitor General Brooks and Ms. Hilton about prosecuting those crimes and protective orders in a moment. But before we get there, I'd like to just talk about, we looked at the statistics and it says 1 in 3 women, 1 in 4 men, and 1 in 2 non-binary individuals are going to experience domestic violence at some point in their lifetime. And so I wanted to talk with, again, staying with April, Melissa, are there warning signs or red flags that someone should look for when dating? Or that parents, or Karima, that parents should look for when their teens are dating? You talked about the dating violence protection, bill. What are the warning signs that parents should be looking for, or that, any individual dating should be looking for? And I'll turn first to Melissa.
Before going over some warning signs, I will say that I think April brought up a very good point, that regardless of what we say, we can't say what it looks like in every single relationship. I think that's very important to mention, so that what we talk about is really what we've seen across many relationships, not just one particular prototype that matches every relationship's circumstance. But some of the ones that we talk about that you might see in behavior. Oh, before I even get to that, I want to say too, a lot of times this behavior isn't something that is public to everyone to see. This is most times behavior that happens behind closed doors. So this person is not someone that you can say that, oh, you can just pick out all these behaviors, and because they have these behaviors, this is someone who is abusive. Usually this person could be someone who most likely might be very, a person who doesn't appear to be the same behind closed doors, which a lot of survivors always mention how it's so hard to talk to family or friends about what's going on, because to them, this person is not who they see. So it becomes a barrier for them sometimes to even express what's going on at home. But behind closed doors, sometimes this person, most times, is extremely jealous. This person might be very controlling over finances, over that person's own autonomy. When it comes to their body, they're very manipulative. They might intimidate them with threats, doing harm to themselves, their children, even pets. Maybe refusing to take responsibility for their own actions. A lot of times gaslighting, throwing that blame to the actual survivor, or minimizing it, or outright denying it. It might look like insulting them or putting them down, or really insulting them in front of other people as well. And I think the only thing I will add for teens is, a lot of times we assume that teens do not go through some of the same things that we see in our adult behavior, but it's actually untrue. The teens that I have spoke to that have relayed whether or not that they were afraid that they were in abusive relationships, a lot of times they're doing the similar, if not exact things that the adults are doing. These adults one time were teens. And a lot of times we're very blind to that our teens are experiencing things that we experience in adult relationships. And one of the biggest issues amongst teens is they're very inexperienced when they're dating. So they sometimes don't even see these red flags or even know or have been informed because they're very inexperienced with dating. But with them, it's, you know, we always talk to them about someone who's quickly gets angry with you. We talk about with teens about that possessiveness, that jealousy, someone who doesn't want you to be around your friends or your family members, someone who really wants to get serious really quickly. And that can happen on the adult side too. I don't know if I mentioned that, but someone who really isolates them, who controls what they wear. And I can go on and on. There's so many of them. And I know we're on a panel, so I will switch it over to
That was actually perfect, Melissa. And the only thing I would add to that is nobody falls in love with an abuser. And we've been hearing a lot lately about love bombing. And if you're not familiar with love bombing is when, you know, the partner just showers you with attention, affection, constantly wants to know where you are, where you're going, where you're going to be. And it's all so that they can manipulate you. It's all an abusive tactic. And I can say as a victim or a survivor now of dating violence myself in middle school, there were a lot of things that were happening in my relationship where me and my friends thought, oh my gosh, he must love you so much, because he got angry one time because I had my own line. And those of you who are Xers know how big a deal it was to have your own line back in the 90s. And he thought another guy was calling me. And while I was on the phone, he was heating up my curling iron, waiting for me to get off so he could burn me with my curling iron. And I kept that scar on my arm for more than a decade as a constant reminder of how naive I was about that. But more than that, how uninformed I was. You know, a lot of our schools in the state, they're supposed to contract with outside organizations to facilitate healthy relationship workshops and things like that. But because the standards are so loose, many of them consult with folks who focus on abstinence-only curriculum. And we know that's not what our kids need. We were not having these conversations when I was a 7th and 8th grader at Ralph Bunche Middle School. And I was absolutely a victim of dating violence back then.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. That is so brave of you. And in fact, I think how we can reduce the stigma associated with teens experiencing dating violence is to share our stories. But Sora Ross, I know you were going to add to that.
Yeah, this is something I certainly love to talk about, because red flags is always a big question and it's so hard to understand, you know, what to pull out. The first thing I'll say is this: sometimes it's one of those, if you know, you know. It's sometimes it's just a feeling that something's not right in the way that this relationship feels and in the way that someone treats you. So I always tell people, if nothing else, don't worry about trying to memorize all these signs. If things aren't feeling right to you, if you're feeling pushed on your boundaries or what you're comfortable with doing and so on and so forth, then that is in and of itself a red flag. But I'll quickly just mention, we've covered a lot of ground, but you know, one of the things that is certainly emerging more and more these days is, for young people especially, is the technology abuse. When we talked about following you and knowing, you know, keeping up with where you're going, these days it is really important to understand how people are tracking and keeping aware of your whereabouts. But the only other thing I'll mention that's really difficult sometimes to talk about, but is important to say out loud so that people know to be aware of it and to not stigmatize folks, is sexual abuse. It does happen in intimate partner relationships, in marriages, and in dating relationships. You can experience rape by somebody that you are dating or that you are married to. And so and being forced to have sex or perform sexual acts is still a form of abuse, and it is absolutely a crime.
And thank you for that. In a moment, we're going to turn to Solicitor General Brooks and Simone Hilton to talk about how we hold abusers accountable. But before we go there, I want to just pause for a second because you all have given us some really good information on how to spot if a loved one is experiencing or going through domestic violence, or if we ourselves are experiencing these things in our relationship. So what advice would you give to a family member, for example, who recognizes, as Sora Ross said, that there's just something that doesn't seem right going on here? How do they engage their loved one in a conversation to see if that person needs help? Or what do you do if a family member or a friend comes to you and they confess and they relate to you that they're experiencing what they believe to be domestic violence? How do we have those conversations? Where do we find the resources for those individuals to start them on a path to healing? So, Melissa, I'll kick it off with you. As our, representing our partner organization, who you're boots on the ground in terms of providing these resources, and then I'll open it up to anyone else who wants to add on.
Well, we always talk about, like, if you have someone that comes to you, that you believe that might have abuse going on in their household, to really create a safe and private space. This isn't a conversation that you want to have in front of their intimate partner. You want to make sure that this is a conversation that's completely away from that other person, and that you are there to listen. You're not there to give advice. You're not there to judge. You are there to allow that person to know that you're here for them in whatever they feel. They lead the conversation. We definitely try to validate their experience, which means being from an empathetic ear, not from a way that they feel like they should not have even talked to you at all. And then, of course, don't take it personal if they don't want to take your advice. If they don't choose to come back and talk to you, don't take it personal if you spend hours talking with this person about resources or things that that they would like to converse about, and then they go back to that person as well. I think the most important takeaway is, if they are ready to talk and they are ready to safety plan, and you're not someone who feels you're equipped to do so, that you connect them with the resource that's able to safety plan with them and let them know what other resources are available to them. And I think most importantly, know that this is a very unsafe time for them when they start having wanting to do these conversations, and they're confiding in you that it's a very unsafe, and they know it's unsafe. And sometimes just going back is just a fear that they're not going to be able to get away, and what that retaliation might look like, or really fearing that this person is going to kill them. So if they don't take a resource, it might not be safe enough for them to take a resource. If they are not ready to leave, it might mean that they don't know how to leave. But just know that every time that you speak to them, and every time that you have that private space with them, just being encouraging, just being non-judgmental, and just being open to continue to have that conversation, it's all resonating in them. It's like a seed that is going to flower at some point. But I would say those are the things that I would encourage someone to do if they are going to have that conversation.
I know that we have some Soras who are going to drop some links, and they've been dropping links in the chat on YouTube, but I would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to mention that you can get additional information from PADV at https //padv.org. And you can find additional resources there. And you mentioned a safety plan. Can you, or April, can you talk to us, what is a safety plan, and why would someone need a safety plan?
I was going to let Melissa keep rolling. That's still kind of your role. But, I can talk a little bit about safety planning if you want. But Melissa's more direct services, if you want to jump back in.
A safety plan, just to not go into a full definition of what it really is, but just to what we do when we safety plan is really sitting down and making a concrete plan of kind of what if something was to happen. And that doesn't look like always when you are choosing to leave. We safety plan many times where people are not ready to leave. Again, these are their loved ones. They love this individual. This is someone who they might have even had children with, who they might be married to. So they're really hopeful, and they that this person could potentially change. So sometimes within that time where they want to stay in the relationship, we will safety plan so that we can think through what if something was to go wrong. And that could be thinking of where to pack their their important documents, a change of clothes, something that they need for their children, like birth certificates, and putting it in a bag and putting it somewhere safe, that in the midst of something happening in that household, that's something they don't have to worry about. Or it could be mapping out a certain word that gets yelled out, where the kids know to go out the door and go down 2 doors down to the neighbor who will allow them to call 911 so that that survivor can get some help. So it's really just mapping out and really taking time when the situation is not going on to really think through what are different scenarios and different things that you might not think about when something is happening. We even have teen safety plans as well that helps them map out a safe way, especially when a lot of times what we don't think about with our teens is they don't really sometimes have the choice in where they go to school, what activities they're in, changing classrooms if this person who just abuse them is sitting in the classroom with them. So really mapping out a safety plan if they feel even unsafe at school, unfortunately, because this person is in the same building as them. But really the safety plan is to create that concrete plan in the time of a crisis happening while a crisis is not happening, so that you can really think through what next steps would be.
Thank you. We really appreciate that. And we're going to be dropping resources in the comments for anyone who may be experiencing this or need additional information, some follow-up resources. I want to shift now to something that Karima talked about earlier, right? Like, we can't prosecute our way out of this situation. However, we do know that in Georgia, in particular in Clayton County, which is one of our service areas, in Fulton County, another one of our service areas, we do have dedicated professionals who are available to work with survivors of domestic violence to hold abusers accountable. So I want to shift to a couple of questions to Solicitor General Brooks and Ms. Hilton. Can you talk to us about how can we as a society hold abusers accountable, and specifically in Clayton County and Fulton County? So I'll first turn to Solicitor General Brooks.
I think the first step is an acknowledgement that this is a thing that's actually happening. I think we all started this conversation that it's happening in silence. It's happening in darkness. So bringing light to it and talking about it is the first step. The second step is to broaden our scope of what a victim looks like. I think Ms. Dillard referenced that the burning bed. There's this image of a woman who's truly beaten blue and black, and just broken down to the point where you have this image that if this is not her, then domestic violence is not happening. And that's in my line of work. I'm a solicitor, and so I do misdemeanor offenses. The large majority of the offenses that we deal with are not people who have black eyes, broken bones, or anything like that. The large majority are pushes, spitting, strong talking, and anything of that sort. What people might call petty offenses or minor offenses. But these things are the doorway to the more serious offenses. Most of your black eyes, your broken bones, they don't start that way. They start with a push. They don't even start with a push. They start with a strong, somebody get cussed out probably in most instances. Then it escalates to that. Then it gets to a push, and then it's a punch, and then it escalates. And so I think if the first step is one, talking about it. The second step is broaden our scope of what a victim looks like, or a survivor looks like. And also to that end, broaden your scope of what an abuser looks like. There's an expression that men that wear wife beaters, right? The tank top, and you got this image of a man who's an abuser. An abuser could be a man in a suit. An abuser can be a man with a badge. An abuser could be a judge. An abuser could be a minister. There is no typical image of what an abuser looks like. And so recognizing those three things, that is happening. That victims don't have a one uniform look, and abusers don't have a one uniform look. Is a great way to get us in the right direction of accountability.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Sora Hilton.
And the only thing I would actually add is having more conversations like this to the community. And so that the community is aware that some of the misconceptions of what abuse looks like. And so when you're talking about holding individuals accountable, understanding that an abuser doesn't look a certain way. And it's interesting that what Solicitor General Brooks said, because I think I've had defendants who fit all those categories. I've had defendants who were pastors. I've had defendants who were businessmen. I had defendants who were doctors. I have defendants who were in all of these different roles committing these heinous crimes. And so I think that continuing educating our community about what abuse looks like, what it is, and not just in October, right? Throughout the entire year, because I think sometimes we focus in on October, which is great. We have this month and it's dedicated and we need it, but we need to be talking about this every single month going out into the community. And in my office, we do that. We train law enforcement officers. We have to train law enforcement officers because sometimes law enforcement officers look at different things, and we're having to go out and train about what abuse looks like. How do you speak to a victim on the scene to make her him or her not feel victimized by the police? And so we are having a lot of conversation, a lot of training. So not just the community, but our law enforcement partners, and making sure that everyone is aware about what's happening.
And are there additional resources available in your offices to assist victims of domestic violence? We know that these, as I think one of you mentioned in your opening statement, these are unique cases, right? These are people who you're asking to testify under oath in a court of law against someone who may be a family member. Are there additional resources to provide that holistic wraparound services type approach to prosecuting these cases? If you can talk to that, that'd be really helpful.
Yes. So within our office, in the Fulton County DA's office, we have victim advocates. And essentially what they do, they are with our victims usually at every step. So once a case is brought in, what we call the first appearance. So the initial appearance of an individual after they've been arrested, the victim is usually made contact with. Depending on the severity of the crime, we have a partnership with PADV actually. And so we will refer certain victims to PADV to start some additional resources, because we may not have internal resources, but we're going to make sure that the victim gets the services that they need. If they're not referred to PADV, we find out what is it that you need, right? Because we don't just want to offer and it's not a need. So we find out what it is that our victim needs at that moment, and we try to partner or find those resources for that individual so that we can get them to where they need to be. We also understand the criminal justice process can be a slow process. And so you may come in, there might be an arrest in August, but we might not get to court until January, February, March. And so we're making sure that we stay in contact as much as with our survivors, or so that we can continue to check in and making sure what resources are available, what they may need. And sometimes they may need some, sometimes they may not, but we make sure that we put them in the right space and make sure we partner and get them the resources that they need.
Absolutely. And Solicitor General Brooks?
Very similar to what Ms. Hilton stated for Fulton County DA's office, same as for Clayton County Solicitor General's office. We have victim advocates who assist in every stage of the criminal process. We also partner with community advocates to provide additional assistance. Our advocates on the courtroom side, they do something called a lethality assessment, basically where they're trying to assess whether or not this is a case that has the potential to be a lethal case, lead to a fatality. When they are doing that assessment, they are also safety planning with the victims of these crimes. Additionally, we outsource the need, whatever the need is. We don't necessarily provide it, but we can direct our folks to who can actually provide the service. From there, we try to not even try. We establish very very early on what the victim's rights are in the process. In Georgia, we have the Victims' Bill of Rights, and so we go through what those rights are and how they interact with the criminal justice system and how we can help them through this process.
That's really helpful. So there's a Victims' Bill of Rights that helps you all in the work that you're doing. Advocate for victims of domestic violence in these prosecutions. Can we pivot and just talk about, because I believe Simone mentioned this earlier, and we said we would touch back on this spousal abuse as a crime. Is that a crime in the state of Georgia? And can you talk about what makes that unique and what are the challenges in prosecuting those cases? But then also, how does someone get a protective order if they're dealing with a spouse or someone in their home who is engaging in domestic violence? Can you talk about those processes as well?
Spousal abuse absolutely is a crime. I think it was Ms. Ross who referenced a couple of different scenarios, but no means no in every scenario, whether you're married or whether you're dating. And if one spouse doesn't accept that no and takes an action contrary to a consensual action, then it's illegal. And how we prosecute the same way that we would if a person was not married. Now, as it relates to obtaining a TPO or a protective order, that process is a civil process, but basically you go to in different counties have different setups, but they'll go to an intake clerk generally, usually somebody in the clerk's office. They'll do an intake assessment. They'll take down the information, the details of the incident. Usually it's an incident or a series of incidents. From there, they will take that and set up a time for a hearing. And that's an ex parte hearing with the court, at which point a temporary protective order is put in place. That temporary protective order is put in place until there's an opportunity for a hearing where the opposing party can be present to establish a permanent TPO. In most instances, I think the numbers was about 40% lead to permanent TPOs. But let me just add this caveat to for all of the numbers that you've heard, these are only reported numbers. And so I would double that, probably in some cases triple. And so just recognize that we talk about these numbers, but these numbers are only reported numbers. And so the common colloquial phrase that we use as it relates to COVID-19 is pandemic. The same is to be said about domestic violence. It is a pandemic. It's widespread and it's underreported. And so as relates to spousal abuse, as relates to non-spousal abuse, it's widespread across the board.
And before we leave Clayton County, just an additional question for you, Solicitor General. Clayton County has a large population of native Spanish speakers. How does that impact your ability to prosecute these cases? And then the second question for you, how does cases involving undocumented individuals who are experiencing domestic violence, does that complicate your ability to prosecute those cases? We've heard that, there are undocumented individuals who are afraid to interact with law enforcement, so they may be less likely to call 911 if they're experiencing intimate partner violence or domestic violence. But specifically, how does your office handle prosecuting those cases with undocumented individuals or with, populations who may not speak English fluently in a way to converse with law enforcement or your office?
So I guess the easy part of the question is the language barrier is not a barrier for our office. We have more than one bilingual members of our office who can speak Spanish and other languages, actually, and we have ways to communicate with the other languages. We have a large Asian community in Clayton County as well, so we Vietnamese, Laotian. We have a number of different languages that are spoken in the county, but language is not the barrier. The barrier is exactly what you led with: reporting. If there is no report, it's very hard for us to get involved. But once it is reported, for folks who are afraid of the justice system because of immigration challenges, we are very responsive to and sensitive to that concern. And so we have people in place who assist with obtaining what's called a U visa. U visa is for victims of certain crimes. The domestic violence is one of those crimes where if they participate in the process, they assist in the process, then that can that's a pathway towards citizenship. It leads towards obtaining a green card and ultimately citizenship.
And Sora Roth, I see you wanted to jump in here on that point.
Just to share a resource, one really good resource that's available to folks in Georgia. We have a local office or local branch. It's a national nonprofit called Taharay Justice Center. And Taharay definitely their entire mission is to help provide free legal and social services to immigrant women and undocumented people as well. And so they will help you with the U visas. They will help you if you are a victim of domestic violence and you have a criminal case and you're concerned about your documentation status. But Taharay Justice Center is an excellent resource that we have right here in the Metro Atlanta city limits that can help you if you are an immigrant in an immigrant community or undocumented.
Thank you so much for that. And we'll be sure to share that resource, as well as I know that the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence, if you go to their website at www.gcadv.org, they have a list of domestic violence programs and shelters across the state. So we want to make sure that in addition to having this discussion, that we're providing resources, because we know that this is going to be a discussion that we're going to have on our Facebook page, and it's going to be available on our YouTube. And we're providing all of this really good information, but we want people to also have the resources when they leave, that if they need to get additional information, they need to learn how to make a safety plan, they need to work with others, that they'll have that information. And so that organization that you just mentioned, Sora Ross, I'll just also say it's TAHIRIH.org. That Justice Center, where additional individuals can get information. And so for Sora Hilton, just sort of bringing us back to, what does it look like when somebody calls law enforcement, they file a complaint? What can they expect when their case is being prosecuted through your office? What does that prosecution look like?
Sure. So once the police make an arrest or take out warrants, once the individual is arrested, then the case gets transferred from the law enforcement agency to our office. At that juncture, generally we have a victim advocate who is available to first call, get more information, maybe that the police did not get on scene or that we just need right at that moment. We get additional contact information just in case we lose contact with the victim, so we can be able to reach them at at a later date. After first appearance, a victim is entitled to be at any proceeding that is a part of the victim's Bill of Rights. So they're able to be at any proceeding that happens until that case is resolved. We will inform the victim when that case has been indicted, because generally what happens when someone's arrested, that doesn't mean that they've been formally charged. They've been arrested. We're still doing some investigation to make a decision. Are we going to formally charge them? Are we going to give them a diversion program? In our office, we have a pretrial diversion program, which means before someone is even indicted, we may determine that this is an individual who should not be formally indicted. Maybe there's another pathway. Maybe that pathway is some other rehabilitative pathway. Maybe they need to go to get counseling services. Maybe they need to go to get classes to talk about the different why they got to this place. But we'll make that decision early on, and that's also incorporated with what the victim tells us, right? How do they want the case handled? Sometimes we can agree with the victim, sometimes we cannot. But we do try to factor in what does that look like? What does the victim need at that present moment? Because if this is a partner who might be the sole provider financially, is this an individual who, if this person's incarcerated, the victim may not have any other needs met. We have to take all that into consideration when we're making this decision. And so we determine all that. We speak and we have some conversations about that. If we decide to indict the case, then the next step will be the various different court proceedings. It'll be a plea and arraignment calendar. There might be motions calendars, different court appearances that's going to occur prior to trial. If we're unable to resolve the case prior to trial, then we have to have a trial. Earlier you asked, what happens in certain cases where maybe a victim does not want to be a part of that process. Then that's something we have to determine as an agency. Are we going to move forward with trial or not? And that'll depend oftentimes on the egregiousness of the case. It'll depend on what the facts are of the case. It'll depend on if there's a history of abuse. If this is not the first time it occurred, all those things will factor into whether or not we decide to move forward with trial. And then after a trial, a verdict will come down one way or the other, or an individual might decide to resolve the case by taking a plea. And so all those different things can occur. So it can be a pretrial diversion, it could be a plea, or it can be trial. Sometimes that may be consistent with what the victim wants. Sometimes it may not, but it'll depend on the facts and the egregiousness of the case.
And that leads to a question from the audience that we received. Can you talk to us about the state of Marcy's Law, which was an amendment enacted by Georgia voters in 2018 that said that crime victims have a specific enforceable right, which includes the right to be heard in the judicial process and the right to be notified of proceedings. How does that impact the work that you're doing, Solicitor General Brooks and Simone?
Particularly as it relates to family violence or domestic violence, it's a victim-centered prosecution. And so when you're doing victim-centered prosecution, you cannot move forward without the victim having a voice in the process. Too often what was happening in the criminal justice system, prosecutors were going forward with cases in spite of or ignorant to what the will of the victim might be. And not allowing them an opportunity to participate other than the sole way that the prosecutor wanted them to participate. And that was problematic for a number of reasons, particularly in DV and domestic violence. People are trying to maintain the family unit. And so when you factor that thought frame into it, you need to also be sensitive to what the outcome of a trial might look like, or what the outcome of a dismissal might look like. What, after this case is closed, what is going to happen next? And so that's what Marcy's Law, it just forces prosecutors and forces the criminal justice system to hear what they have to say. That they at sentencing, they have an opportunity to be heard by the judge prior to sentencing, not after. As it relates to sentence recommendations, prosecutors should be speaking to victims prior to making sentence recommendations. Now, our sentence recommendations may not always reflect the will or desire of the victim in the case, but there has to be a conversation with them as to what their desires are and what we likely will recommend. If it's in line or if it's not in line, they need to be informed. And that's part of the Victims' Bill of Rights as well.
And
Thank you for that. Go ahead, Simone.
I was going to say, just to piggyback, and the contrary was happening as well, where victims weren't being notified about what was happening, and therefore individuals might be released. There were in crimes were escalating, unfortunately, leading to homicide. So a victim has a right to know either way what is happening, what is going on in the court process, and to be able to have conversations about that.
That's really helpful. I'd like to shift the discussion to, Ms. Dillard, you talked about ways that we can advocate, and, we're not going to prosecute our way out of these issues. So can you talk to us about what are the ways that we can advocate with our elected officials and government officials to provide better support in this area on the federal, the state, the local level? And then I'll open it up to any other panelists who wants to expound on your response.
Thank you for that, Sharice. I would be remiss if I didn't spend a little bit of time talking about an issue that is emerging and deeply concerning, as the Solicitor General was talking about, how they collaborate with community partners, with referrals and warm handoffs. Our programs are facing an unprecedented funding crisis right now. And advocating with our lawmakers is something that they really want. They want to hear from us. They really take their lead from what we share with them. And I want to just kind of set the stage for you what this could look like. We're talking about program budgets being decimated. We're looking at and this is just domestic violence shelters and community-based programs, the number that I'm about to throw out right now. So it doesn't include victims assistance, it doesn't include sexual assault, it doesn't include child advocacy, it doesn't include CASA. We're looking at a $32 million funding cut this year. And more is expected next year and the year after. So we're talking about, and granted, the funding cut is coming from the federal level. This is the Victims of Crime Act, the Crime Victims Fund. And it's not a taxpayer source of funding. This comes from deferred prosecutions of white collar crimes. But since COVID, there haven't been very many of those. So the fund has been slowly depleting over the last several years, and now it's at an all-time low. And the funding that VOCA is what we know it as, the programs and services that it funds are transitional housing, legal services, counseling. These are all childcare. These are all things that help victims remain free from violence. We talk about preventing violence, preventing the return to violent situations. We know that it takes on average a victim 7 times to leave an abusive partner. So what happens at 7th time, they're ready to go and they get turned away from their local domestic violence program. We're literally talking about tens of thousands of victims being turned away from services. We're talking about hundreds of folks being laid off. This is really a crisis, and our legislature likes to say that they don't fix problems that started at the federal level. But the reality is it may have started at the federal level, but it's ending at the state level. And it's something that we have to take responsibility for. That being said, any piece of legislation that you feel passionate about, I can almost guarantee you it will have a direct impact on survivors. A lot of legislators, I've heard them say, I really wish you all would kind of stay in your lane and just really focus on domestic violence issues. And to that I counter, what's a domestic violence issue? Is anything having to do with childcare, paid leave, TANF, Medicaid. These are all survivor impacted issues. So if you're passionate about it, talk to your local lawmaker about it. And if you don't believe that this funding crisis is in effect a crisis, go call your local program and ask them how they're going to be impacted by these cuts. I'm talking about like half of folks' budgets are about to be slashed, half. And that is a crisis if I've ever heard of one.
And just to piggyback off what Ms. Dillard was stating about what's happening with the VOCA grants. It's not just happening with community advocates. Those VOCA grants also impact prosecution officers. And so some of the advocates and prosecution officers are funded by VOCA grants. And so the number of advocates on the courtroom side are going to be reduced as well, and are being reduced this year, in fact.
And so what I'm hearing from you, because again, this is the Social Action Committee of the Atlanta Suburban Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and social action is what we do, is that we need to, as a sorority, but then also as a community, we need to be advocating for proper funding for these priorities with these organizations. So we need a call to action, so to speak, to ensure that these organizations and this work that's important, I believe someone mentioned April mentioned at the beginning of our discussion that this impacts Black and Brown communities more than other communities. And then when we look at the data, we know that our LGBTQIA community is impacted even more than others. And so if those are issues that are important to us, then we need to put our advocacy behind those requests. We have Delta Days at the state capitol coming up in January. So I'm hearing that we probably need to be thinking about some asks to our members of the State House, on these issues. But Melissa, can you also talk to us about how can we better support the organizations, the community organizations that are doing this work to assist victims of domestic violence, the boots on the ground organizations? How can we support the work that you're doing?
I think, the biggest support is exactly what Karima was saying at this moment. We are a domestic violence agency. We, as well as our sexual assault agencies and other advocacy agencies across the state, are really faced with having to see how do we decrease our staff when we have such a great need ahead of us. We rely on, as it is, interns and volunteers to meet the gap that we try to make sure that every person hears a live voice that helps on that other side of that call. So right now, I think the biggest help is exactly of taking our concerns to every platform in front of every person to say how this is a call of action, that we do need to know that this is potentially going to be someone not on that other side of that phone call that will potentially lead to that number that we had this year at 193, increasing even more. That this has a ripple effect, that this is a public health issue, that this is very important for us to address, and that we cannot be silent. We can't be silent. I think that is the very best that we can ask for at this moment, is for everyone to rally around us and provide the support and use your voices to speak about how imperative it is for us to stay open, for there to be someone on the other end of that call when that crisis is happening for our survivors.
And thank you so much for that. I'm sure you'll accept donations as well. We can donate to organizations doing this work. We can look for those grants, and we can ask our elected officials to ensure that grant money is available, but we can also provide donations, in-kind donations and financial donations to those organizations as well that are doing that work. I'm going to take a couple more questions from the chat, and then I'm going to turn it back to you all to give your closing thoughts on this area. But one question that came from the chat is, how can family members report domestic violence involving someone who may have an intellectual disability and can't process that they may be a victim of domestic violence? How does that work? We talked about how reporting domestic violence and when someone is ready to leave is the most dangerous time for that individual. So how does that work when you have a family member who wants to report domestic violence on someone's behalf? What advice would you give to that family member?
Well, when we're talking about reporting DV, as advocates, we always come from the standpoint when it's not a protective class, when it's not a protected population, because we are mandated reporters, but when it's not, then it's that survivor's choice if they want to report what's happening to them to the police. So that's always their choice. But when it's a protective class, like someone who's disabled, a child, if it's an elder, when there is the protective classes, that's different. That does need to be reported. And if it's reported to an advocate, that person is a mandated reporter to report it to the authorities. So that's just two different things. I would say that they can report it to either a health professional, they can report it to law enforcement, they can call the state line and ask for help if they don't know who to report it to. Just depends on what the circumstances. But if that person is one of the protective classes, then we are mandated to actually report that to the authorities.
And Melissa, that state hotline that you referenced, are you referring to 1-800-33-42836 or 1-800-33-HAVEN?
The second one is the one I was referring to, but I don't
Okay.
know, maybe April, do you know what the first one is?
It's the same thing, it's just, it was Haven.
Oh,
spelled
okay,
out.
so I'm used to just saying it, but okay, just excuse
So
me.
1-800-33-HAVEN, which is also 1-800-334-2836 is the Georgia statewide hotline that if someone had concerns about a family member who has an intellectual disability experiencing domestic violence, they could reach out there and get additional information.
And I was going to say, if they're going to report it to law enforcement, as much evidence as you have maybe gathered, that you've seen, that you've witnessed, you're going to want to provide that, because the law enforcement agency can only do with the evidence that they have, right? And so if you're going to report it, just making sure that you have evidence. And that could be something you've seen, something that you've witnessed, something that maybe they've confided in you about what happened in a certain way or in a certain manner, and making sure that that information is communicated to law enforcement, because they're going to need as much information in order to start or open an investigation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Oh, go ahead, Melissa.
Well, the only thing I would also add to that is that if they are a caretaker over that person, and they're seeing like someone outside is being abusive to that person, a protective order process could potentially help too. I did want to say that in Fulton County, we have the Safe Families Office is where we do our protective orders for intimate partner violence cases. And that is in the Superior Court in Atlanta. And it's the Partnership Against Domestic Violence Advocates that work side by side with Atlanta Volunteer Lawyer Foundation. And then they have attorneys as well as social workers in that office as well. So that's also another option, but I also wanted to mention that we do have a wonderful program in Fulton, which is Safe Families Office.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the second question from the audience that I was going to ask before we turn it over for closing statements. Solicitor General Brooks and Simone, you talked about protective orders or TPOs. The question that we got was, what is the minimum criteria to obtain a protective order? Does it require physical violence or verbal threat? If you can maybe speak to that for us.
I don't think there's a bright line standard as to the minimum. It's a case-by-case evaluation by the court. And based on the facts that are articulated and heard by the court, they'll make determination whether or not it's sufficient. It's in legal terms, it's kind of like probable cause. There is no bright line definition of what probable cause is, nor is there a bright line construction of what the minimum actions would be to get a TPO. If you feel like you are in need of a TPO, apply and let the court make the evaluation.
Thank you, Simone. Anything to add to that?
No.
Okay, and they can always reach out to your offices, and I believe Melissa also identified some additional resources. If somebody was interested in pursuing a protective order, you can reach out. There are the national domestic violence resources that are available to you. I know we've been dropping that information in the chat, but I'll just mention it again here for those who are watching the replay of this. The National Domestic Violence Hotline, you can reach at 1-800-799-SAFE. That's 1-800-799-7233. You can also text START, START, to 88788. And then there are some additional resources, Georgia, as well as our partner organizations that are on the call with us today, that will make that information available to you. So I know we only have a couple of minutes, and I so appreciate the patience of our panelists as we had technical difficulties starting. But I do want to give you all an opportunity as we wrap up to give some closing thoughts. We touched on a lot of different topics today. What does an abuser look like? What are the warning signs? What are the red flags to look for in dating, teens or older individuals? What are the resources available to individuals who have decided that they are ready to seek assistance in leaving a domestic violence situation? What do the prosecutions look like? What are the difficulties in prosecuting these cases? And then also on the flip side of things, because we're not just going to focus on the issue, we're focusing on solutions. And Ms. Dillard told us, what does advocacy look like in this area? So if you can give us in a minute or two your parting thoughts to anyone who's viewing this, whether they are experiencing domestic violence, know someone who's experiencing domestic violence, what is your takeaway of what they need to ensure that they individually or we as a community are addressing this issue? So I'm going to give the first opportunity to Ms. Dillard and followed by Sarah Ross.
Thank you. I'll just say really quickly that as we've said so many times during our panel today, we are disparately impacted. And by we, I mean people of color, LGBTQI plus folks, of which I belong as well. We are so much more disparately impacted than other communities when it comes to intimate partner violence. And when you think about outreach, prevention, these are some of the issue areas that get kind of pushed to the side when we have funding cuts as significant and stark as the ones we're facing right now. And I believe that if we knew that if I knew I could call PADV and not feel like I had to go to shelter, but that they may have somebody who can help me apply for a job or help me with transitional housing or help me get a TPO. You know, if I knew that these services and resources existed, then I might take advantage of those, and the possibility that I could succumb to domestic violence lessens. I think every other day, and I think actually the rate is even higher now because the number is 193, but roughly every other day somebody dies as a result of domestic violence. Somebody dies. So we're talking real people. If you've ever been to a candlelight vigil and heard those names being called, and I can say I went to Women's Resource Center's vigil last week, and I was shocked by how many members of our human community in Georgia were fatalities. Members, our elders, people who were 75, 80, 65, babies, 1 month old, 1 year old. These are people in our communities who have literally been taken from us. So we're talking about human lives. We're talking about real people, not just numbers. And when you go to your legislator and talk about these issues, if they're hearing it from everyday people, not just advocates, not just program directors, but they're hearing from you in the community, that matters. That makes a difference.
Thank you so much. Sarah Ross.
Karima, it's always a hard act to follow, but we work so closely together, and she says so much that we all, that needs to be said. And, when it comes to Georgia, I'll just say this: we are a unique state in this matter, because in some respects, Georgia has taken taken steps that are far more advanced than other states in the nation. But in other respects, Georgia is woefully behind the game. And when I say Georgia, I'm talking about our policymakers. We are the only state in the nation that has a dedicated government agency committed to the state's response to family violence, and that's my agency. And they recognize us. I'm gonna quote from when they created the statute. They recognize that family violence accounts for many serious injuries, deaths, and extensive physical and emotional damage to children and adults. And an effective response to family violence will require a comprehensive community effort, as well as coordination among the courts, prosecutors, law enforcement, correctional system, and our public assistance, meaning our government. And yet they have, year after year, knowing that the funding cuts are coming, that it affects all of us on this call, in our jobs and our ability to do our jobs, not decided to step up and fund our state. We are routinely among the top, this year we're around the 30th in the nation, but we're routinely in the top 10 or 12 states in the nation for the rate of family violence, homicides, and murder suicides. And I'll just say this quickly as far as resources. The State Commission on Family Violence can be a resource. If you don't know where else to go, you can reach out to us and we will help you. We offer safety planning. We also help you find the agency or resource that you need to reach. If you are impacted by a murder suicide, we are the only agency in the nation that has a direct service program for you. There is no prosecution in these cases, so no normal services are activated in most cases. And so if you are impacted by that, Georgia has a resource free to every citizen in the state to provide direct services and support to you. But be a part of your coordinated community response. Find your family violence task force in your community. If your community does not have one, start one, or encourage your local offices that are a part of the family violence response to start it. And we look forward to partnering with organizations like Delta Sigma Theta and anyone else who is listening here to help us advocate coming in January for the support that these agencies need to survive and to help people survive.
Absolutely. And so, Russ, we look forward to partnering with you in that advocacy in this upcoming session. Melissa, let me turn to you as one of our direct service providers for your closing thoughts.
Sure. I just want to thank you again for having us all on here and have this conversation. I do want to just say abuse is a choice. I know we've spoke a lot about really wraparound services for survivors, but the Georgia Commission on Family Violence also has the FFIB program. And I know we didn't get to it tonight. And I know I'm no expert, April is the expert when it comes to that, but I wanted to bring it up for those who are listening in and kind of recognize some of the behaviors we were talking about that are red flags, whether in themselves or in a family or a friend member, that person can receive help to understand the type of behaviors they have to start having that accountability and start making those changes. And it's a great program. And we work with some of the FFIB providers across the state, well, within Atlanta, in regard to being the victim liaison in that program. So I don't want it to seem like there is no way this person can get any assistance when Simone talks about counseling for them. She's really talking about that FFIB program, which is a great program for abusers to be able to start seeing that their behaviors are unhealthy. And then lastly, I wanted to just say that the really great part of this conversation is that now we are all empowered. We're empowered with information that we might not have known before, that we know now, that can change lives, that everyone who is listening into this panel right now has information that can save a life. So if you, whether it's giving that resource, whether it's noticing some of those signs or red flags that we mentioned, or whether it's literally just calling in and connecting that person and saying, hey, here's someone who can now help, or let's sit down and safety plan. I just encourage you to continue to pass along the information you learned tonight so that we can completely shed a light on domestic violence.
Thank you so much. Solicitor General Brooks.
The goal of my office is to be a catalyst of radical community transformation, to be a tool for stopping crime on all levels by addressing crime at the lowest level, and to change mentalities and behaviors, to be a vehicle for changing mentalities and behaviors. This whole conversation about domestic violence, about intimate partner violence, about family violence, ultimately is a conversation about accountability. And if there is accountability yields reform. And reform is change in action, change in behavior, change in mentality. And I think that's the takeaway from this conversation. You get to that by talking about it. You get to that by acknowledging individual accountability and societal accountability, because there's a role for both the individual and society. I want to thank everybody for participating in the conversation. I want to thank the Atlanta Suburban Alumni Chapter of Delta for hosting this conversation. I want to encourage more conversations, not just October, but domestic violence 365 days of the year, because it happens every day.
Thank you so much for the amazing work that you're doing in this area for survivors of domestic violence. It can't be understated that, you know, when someone is brave enough to come forward, being able to follow up with that prosecution and that accountability that you spoke about is essential to the well-being of us as a community. And so with that, I'm going to turn to my soror, Simone Hilton, and give you the last closing statement of the night.
That's usually the hardest place to go when you have such dynamic people right ahead of you. But I want to give out 3 numbers: 672, 550. Those are the number of cases in my office, in my unit, that we're prosecuting. 672 open indicted cases of people affected by domestic violence. 500 unindicted cases. So these are cases in the background. 50 homicides, 50 lives lost to domestic violence. And like Solicitor Brooks said earlier, these numbers are probably triple, because this is only what's been reported. And that's just in Fulton County. So that doesn't take what Solicitor General is doing in Clayton County State Court. He also has the DA's office that has domestic violence cases in Clayton County. In Fulton County, we have the Solicitor General's office that's taken on more cases. So this is what we call a pandemic within a pandemic. And so the conversations that are happening have to continue happening so we can continue to educate our community, and so that we can try to eradicate it. We can try our best to have these numbers decrease. And the way that we do that is more education, getting out into the community, having resources for both our victims and those who are being held accountable as abusers, because it changes within. Like I said, I can prosecute you, but if you haven't changed within to change the behavior, it's going to continue. And so that is what we need to do as a community. I love my sorority and my chapter for having this conversation, and we're going to have to continue having the conversation and being a resource to those who have been affected by domestic violence. And so thank you for bringing us together. Thank you for having this. And let's continue to have this conversation, not just in October, but 365 days a year.
And thank you so much. On behalf of the Physical and Mental Health Committee and Social Action Committee of the Atlanta Suburban Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, I have to thank all of you for the insight that you provided on this panel. I love that this resource is going to be available and is going to live on our YouTube page and on our Facebook for the people who could not attend tonight, or for the people who were maybe here and did not feel brave enough to ask certain questions, that they have the numbers, they have the websites, they know the resources that they can now go to get assistance. This is a pandemic in our community. I also would be remiss if I didn't mention that we have upcoming elections coming up on November 7th, local elections. Next year in 2024, we're going to have some really big elections. We have to ensure that we are using our vote as our voice, and we're using our voice to promote for us as a community what we need. And what we need is proper funding, and we need resources in this area of domestic violence so that we can reduce those numbers that Sarah Hilton mentioned. This is about us as a community. And so again, thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you for the resources. Thank you to those who participated in the chat and in the comments, who asked questions, who provided resources. If we can be of assistance to you at the Atlanta Suburban Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, feel free to reach out to us, social action at asacdst.org. And with that, I'm going to say have a great night, everyone. And thank you so much for your patience with our later start time. Be blessed.